Welcome to Socrates in the City. So thrilled to see so many of you here tonight. Thank you for coming. Many of you have come from foreign countries. Our speaker, Gabriele Kuby, has come all the way from Germany. And now I'm curious as I stand here, is there any one of you here who has flown here to be here tonight? Would you raise your hand from Germany? Keep them up, keep them up. That's unbelievable. Ausgezeichnet. It's terrific to see so many of you here at the Yale Club. I'm just curious, I have to ask these questions up front. How many of you know about Socrates in the City from my radio program, principally? So very, very few. Very few. I'm always curious how people know about things. I want to, first of all, thank the King's College. The King's College has been involved in putting these events together. I used to do more to put these events together, and I hated it so much I farmed it out to some people. And then they farmed it out to the King's College. But I want to say to the King's College, thank you, honestly, for putting this together. We've never done an event at the Yale Club before, and the simple reason for that is I hate the Yale Club. As you know, I graduated from Yale, and just a lot of bad memories, and I try to avoid this club, but the price point was right, so we had to do it. But I apologize, because I hate this place. Actually, I don't really and truly hate it. The real word would be despise, and listen to me, there's a difference. Words matter. Look it up. But some good things in my life have happened in this club. I'm not kidding. In 1996, I married my first wife, Suzanne Metaxas. Our reception was here in that club. And honey, so far so good. 21 years ago. Unbelievable. And we had our first breakfast in this room. And I remember criticizing it at the time. It wasn't what we were looking for. It wasn't what we'd paid for, was it? And we said we will never go to the Yale Club again. 21 years ago, I made that vow in my heart, and all my Christian friends say, Eric, you got to let it go. You got to let it go. And so tonight, I'm prepared to begin to let it go. So I just want to thank you for making that possible by being here tonight at the Yale Club. But we really did have our wedding reception down on the second floor. It just seems like yesterday. Susanna has had no work done. Look at that beautiful face. Look at that. She's had no work done that I know of. And I look at the bills. Believe me, I check. Nothing. She's done nothing. It's good genes. She can't take credit. It's good genes. But that's 21 years ago, and we really did have our first breakfast, brunch right in this room. So it's kind of wonderful to be here. If either of us seems fatigued, it's because, as I think I mentioned, we've been married for 21 years. So I just want to say, no, that's not why. We're fatigued because we literally just got back from Israel, which we had a wonderful, wonderful time. We had the privilege of meeting Prime Minister Netanyahu, not the Prime Minister Netanyahu, but there are several that they have. And one of them, this guy, in fact, took my breath away. He was the tiniest guy, super tiny, but he looked a lot like Netanyahu. And on cameras, you can't even tell because the cameras, they change. But we did get to meet him, and we enjoyed that, didn't we, honey? Should I move on? I think I better move on now. But we really had a wonderful time there. And I have to say, you hear people say this over and over, but when the plane landed and we got on the bus to go from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, I never, ever expected to be emotionally moved the way I was. I genuinely got choked up just thinking this is where Jesus walked. Now, it's the most trite observation anyone could make in a place like Jerusalem, right? And yet it just choked me up. And I have to say, the experience of being there where he was, I actually think it drew me closer to him for good, which is a good thing. It's a good reason to go to Israel. But it was that powerful. But anyway, if I look fatigued, it's because I'm still on jet lag, having just some jet lag here. Okay. The subject of tonight's conversation. Now, you all know, many of you know this, the point of Socrates in the City is to talk about things that people typically don't talk about, right? We live in a culture that is uncomfortable talking about the real, the big questions, the things that everybody's really thinking about, you know, where do I go when I die? Is there a God? What does it mean to be a human being? Is it wrong to have sex with a cow? That kind of stuff. Oh, like you haven't thought of that. Come on. The big questions, those big nasty questions that people never mention in polite society. In fact, even I didn't just mention that because we're going to edit that out. But the point is that people avoid really substantive questions. And I think that's fundamentally unhealthy. And the reason we started Socrates in the City in the year 2000, that used to sound like the future, right? In the year 2000, when we're all wearing silver jumpsuits. Back in the year 2000, we started this with the idea that Socrates famously said the unexamined life is not worth living, right? And to examine our lives, to think about the big questions, there's something fundamentally healthy, especially in a place like New York, where people are going after the brass ring. They don't want to say the wrong thing at a cocktail party. Well, I think that can be really unhealthy. And so we wanted to provide a forum where people can ask the big questions, the deep questions, and some of them get uncomfortable. So what are we talking about tonight? Well, what we're talking about tonight, some of you have noticed, I think, that there's some things going on in the culture that are a little bit odd or different, and you're kind of wondering what's going on. It didn't start then, but one of the markers in our culture was when one of my childhood heroes, this incredible athlete, Bruce Jenner, said that he was actually a woman. And don't laugh, my goodness. Don't laugh. I'm very uncomfortable with the thought that you would even think about laughing at that. Well, isn't this the point, right? Like you think, should I laugh? Is he joking? We live in a culture where that actually happened. What bothers me is not that it happened, but the perception that if you even think to question it, something's wrong with you, right? That to me is unhealthy. And I think that most of us, when you talk about what is the elephant in the room, it's not that, but it's the fact that you are told how to respond to that, and if you don't respond that way, something's wrong with you. That, to me, is the end of a free culture, of a free society, and we have to speak up against it, and we have to do what we can civilly but boldly to ask the questions that many people aren't asking. So when Bruce Jenner decided he's a woman, you were told instantly to say, oh, that's a good thing, and Annie Leibovitz made him look great on the cover of Vanity Fair, which is insane. But you're told that you have to think that. And I thought to myself, well, maybe some people think that, but maybe some people don't think that. And if you don't think that, maybe there's a reason you don't think that. But we don't dare go there. So a lot of strange things keep happening, and we're told just to keep moving. Like 2 days ago, or a day ago, a high school student, a boy who believes he's a girl, won the state wrestling championship as a girl. Now, I think you know, boys tend to be able to better wrestlers than girls. Not always, but I don't want to offend any muscular girl wrestlers in the room because I know you're here. But the point is that when you read that, you knew at some point in the future that joke would happen, right? That somebody would say, yeah, even though I'm a dude, I'm going to wrestle as a girl, and I'm going to win. And I'm going to win all state. And that literally happened 2 days ago. And you're told that's the way it is now. And you kind of think something's going on. Is this a good thing for young women? We're not supposed to ask that question. Last night, I was at Wahlburgers with two friends getting a burger, and on the TV I saw some Olympic coverage, and there were three people, one of whom was former figure skater Johnny Weir, who was wearing some kind of a crescent-shaped diamond tiara and a white blouse that I'm pretty sure he borrowed from Sandra Day O'Connor. I shouldn't say that. Could have been Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but it was one of those things. The strangest thing is not that a man is wearing that on TV, but that no one is allowed to say, that's the weirdest freaking thing I've ever seen on the Olympics. You're not allowed to say that, even though most people are actually thinking that. So it strikes me as odd that you're being told how to think, and it scares me a little bit. There's a phenomenon going on. And this is across the board. It applies to me. I remember early in my marriage with Suzanne, we were kissing, and a picture of Ed Asner flitted through my mind really quickly. And I have to be honest with you, it was quick, but I saw what I saw. And ever since then, I have wondered, and you can't help wondering, maybe secretly I would be happier in a relationship with Ed Asner. I don't know. Or another hairy, broad-backed man from the 70s. Maybe it doesn't have to be Ed Asner. Maybe he was just a type of something that I'm longing for. Anyway, this stuff, it goes on and on and on. I know my friend Rich Egan is here if he hasn't run out of the room. Rich called me up this morning. This is the kind of stuff just that happens, and this is what I want to talk about. Rich called me up this morning, asked me about the dress code. Only my friends ask me, where is it? What's the dress code? Like, hey, I'm kind of busy. I'm trying to prepare insulting remarks tonight about you, and you're calling me up and you're bugging me. And so he calls me, what's the dress code? And at that point, he paused, and he said that he was feeling particularly frilly and feminine. And did I mind if he wore the lace teddy I bought him 2 summers ago in Antibes? Yeah. And that's when I knew that we're going through something as a culture. When my friend Rich Egan felt comfortable to ask me that question this morning, Rich, I hope you're not wearing it. I told you not to, but it's your decision. But the point is that we live in this new world. And I think that one way of labeling whatever it is that we're going through is to call it a global sexual revolution, right? Revolutions sometimes are good, sometimes bad. There's 2 sides. There's good points, there's bad points. That's a fact, right? There's good points and bad points to change. But there is a book called The Global Sexual Revolution by our guest tonight, Gabriele Kuby. Now, I cannot remember how I discovered Gabriele Kuby, but when I did, it was one of those revelations where you think, oh my goodness, how have I lived without knowing who this person is and what she writes about? She is an extraordinary writer and thinker. She identifies publicly as a woman. That's all I can say. I'm under the impression she's from Germany, unless that's all an act as well. I don't know. And she flew all the way from Germany to be here, and we are so grateful to have her here. Now, she's done so many things. These introductions oftentimes at Socrates in the City, I don't know quite what to say. I realize that I really want to say, Gabriele, this is the Socrates in the City audience. Socrates in the City audience, this is Gabriele Kuby. And that's the introduction. Is that you? So now you know each other? Okay. Really, the point of the introductions is just to prove how smart and amazing the guest is. And in her case, it's so easy. I laughed, I guffawed when I read this, that she is the niece of Werner Heisenberg. Doesn't that just make you feel stupid? Have you heard of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle? Some of you are going like, yeah, that's like when you're not sure if the 3-minute egg should be 2 minutes or 3 minutes, or she's the niece of someone who literally invented quantum physics. Good reason to hate him and our speaker, because I didn't do well in AP Physics. But he got the Nobel Prize in 1932 for inventing quantum mechanics. Let me say it again. Doesn't that make you feel unbelievably stupid? What have your relatives invented? Like maybe a different way to cook squirrel or something like that? So that's the level of intelligence we're dealing with tonight. And I'm embarrassed. I'm not up to it. But Gabriele, she's in that tradition. If that's not bad enough, she's also the niece of the economist E.F. Schumacher. And for contrast and comparison, you might keep in mind that I am the niece of literally no one. So it's very, very embarrassing. Without further ado, the author of The Global Sexual Revolution, Socrates in the City, please welcome Gabriele Kuby.
First of all, Gabriele, I apologize for everything I just said. It will never happen again.
Where do we begin? You're not going to help me, are you? She's not. Obviously, I want to talk to you about this amazing book with this brave thesis. It's extraordinary. I want to find out a little bit about you because your story is interesting, and ultimately the question is, how do you come to a place in life where you write a book as amazing as this book, which we'll be discussing tonight? What is your journey, as it were?
It's easy to answer, because there was a search for truth all my life. And Edith Stein, the Jewish lady who died in Auschwitz and converted to Catholicism, she said, if you look for truth, you will find God. And so there was this search for truth actually all my life. And at some point, I had to look at the society and say, well, sexuality is a serious issue, and started in research and to put it together.
You were a sociologist. You're no longer academically a sociologist? You're not. I didn't mention your father. Your father was an extraordinary and important and famous journalist. Can you say a word about him and his influence on your life?
Well, he was a left-wing writer and journalist. We are very glad in our family that he was against the Nazis from the very beginning. In every German family, there were different, it split the families, in most of the families had a conflict about this. My father was against it. He was a left-wing journalist. And when I was a student and started studying sociology in West Berlin, when I said my name, which is still Kuby, everybody knew him. And important about my father are two things for myself. I moved into this left-wing student movement as the daughter of my father, not obedient, but as the admiring daughter of my father. So I was not a rebellious bourgeois child which rebelled against the bourgeois society, but I kind of followed my father. And the second element important, he stood up against the mainstream, which then was conservative, Adenauer politics, Strauss in Bavaria and so on. And I was proud that he stood up against the mainstream.
So he was brave.
So he was brave, and in this way he was an example. The contents have changed, but he was an example for me, yes.
So he was a journalist. Did you think when you were in the university that you also would follow in his footsteps and become a writer and a journalist?
Yes, in a way. Writing is, quite a few people have written books in my family, so writing was a gift, and for me too. And yes, I actually did think so. And I became baptized when I was 8 years of age, coming to my mother with tears, saying, "Mommy, will I get into heaven if I'm not baptized?" So that was an important point in my childhood. Then
you mentioned this to me earlier, that your father was an atheist?
Let's say
agnostic?
an agnostic. He never fought against the church. I'm thankful for that.
Okay, but your mother was a serious believer.
She was a believer, but also not within the church. But she was a believer, yes. She was a Christian.
And what do you think led you at age 8 to worry about whether you'll get into heaven?
Maybe I heard it at school. You will not get into heaven if you're not baptized. And I wanted to get into heaven. I still do. I'm not alone. I'm not alone.
Yeah.
So then a big jump to the student movement, which actually was in Berlin, and was on the street at that famous demonstration, which was the match which blew it all up, when Benno ohne Sorg, a student, was shot by a policeman.
Is this 68?
This is 67, the summer term of 67. And I had somehow been elected into this student representative organ, so I was kind of running along with the left-wing movement. And at that demonstration, Benno ohne Sorg was shot. And the story was a criminal policeman had shot in defense of himself. Years later, something like 5 years ago, I could read in the papers that this person who had shot him was a Stasi agent of East Germany, which was really shocking.
Yeah, and for those who
And
don't
he
know,
lived
that's the secret police of
East Germany.
And you were in Berlin.
It was all staged, yeah.
But you were in.
I was in Berlin.
In Berlin.
But I left it after this term. I left this whole movement and left Berlin. But that was really shocking that this whole left-wing movement actually was financed and under the sort of initiated by the communists from East Germany. And it was not an autonomous movement. Of course, there was Berkeley, and there's all this excitement that's coming from Berkeley, but the initiation was, and the whole strategy was from the communists of East Germany.
I don't want to get off on a rabbit trail, but it's fascinating that you say that, because today, a lot of movements are financed by outsiders. You hear about George Soros and others, and maybe we can talk about that. But it's an extraordinary thing because it makes us feel very naive when you realize that what looks like a spontaneous uprising of the people is in fact paid for by elitists with money.
Exactly. As soon as you touch an issue like this, a board comes up, and on it is Verschwörungstheorie.
What is it?
Verschwörungstheorie.
Isn't it always better in German? Verschwörungstheorie.
Good. Well done.
Verschwörungstheorie. Natürlich.
Well done. Exactly.
It sounds better. It sounds more strong. Okay.
Does it?
So.
So as soon as you think about it, what is happening behind the scenes, you're not allowed to think about it because somebody will say conspiracy theory, and then you have to stop thinking. And you have to stop putting pieces together.
Well, which brings us to this book. When you read a book whose title is The Global Sexual Revolution, and I don't remember the subtitle. What is the subtitle?
Destruction of Freedom in the Name of Freedom.
Destruction of Freedom in the Name of Freedom. It sounds like a conspiracy theory. It sounds.
Does it?
Yes, it does.
I tried to avoid this as best I could.
No.
Yeah.
I don't think it is a conspiracy theory, but you can imagine how people would say, this is just someone who has a point of view, who's upset about the way things are, and they make it sound like something bigger than it is. They make it sound as though it's not organic, but it's something that has been planned and that people are planning even now, and which is in fact what you say in your book. But I'm sure you have many critics who dismiss you as a crackpot who just believes that in fact there are powers arrayed who are making this happen, and they would argue, no, this is just a natural evolution of modern society.
Okay, actually, which at the moment is, I realize it's quite astonishing. I didn't really get much criticism for the book. I get very much criticism if I appear in talk shows or wherever. I have demonstrations outside the hall, like here, 200 people on the street demonstrating.
There were people demonstrating here?
Well, I'm glad
they're probably from Harvard. They're just jealous. They're just jealous, yeah.
Okay, but I didn't really get that much criticism for the book, or very, very little, in
When
fact,
did the book come out?
In 2012. And now it is in the 13th translation. I can't quite keep up
Translation?
With that. Yes.
Wow.
I just recently received it in Chinese letters, which was quite funny.
Yeah, it's always very humbling when you can't read your own book, right?
Exactly.
Well, so what is the path that led you from being kind of a left-wing journalist to where you are now, an advocate for this subject?
Okay. Well, I left West Berlin with this feeling something is wrong about it. And then in 73, quite a long time ago, I left the university altogether. I went traveling. It was the fashion at the time, with a little dope in your pocket and the hippie movement.
The little dope in your pocket? Really? Fascinating.
You don't know anything about it.
A little dope in your pocket? Yeah, natürlich. Okay, so of course, we know the 70s, many of us lived through the 70s. So
exactly,
you were traveling, yeah?
Yes, and in 73, I came to Cadaqués, which is a very beautiful town, a little village at the Mediterranean in Spain. And there I saw a sunset, and all of a sudden the whole God was back into my life. God exists. That was the experience.
The sunset in Spain.
Exactly.
Wow.
And I stopped my traveling. My whole life sort of turned around, and I said, well, I've experienced something. How do I go from here? And I found a place how to go on. So my search for God started in '73. And I won't tell you all but from then onwards, it was serious and conscious search for God, which took me 20 years. In '77, I married civilly, without any big, without catechesis really, without a vision of what marriage really is. Which, looking back at this, that so many of us have not been told what it's all about, have not been told what marriage is about, what sexuality is about, how it fits together, and the next generation even less so. So we were not told. We have 3 beautiful children, and our marriage after 18 years got into a crisis, and we both decided to separate. After 20 years of search for God, this is not a very inspiring outcome. Something I must have been searching on the wrong path, and I was actually. New Age, esotericism, psychology. The church was just a no-go in this milieu where I lived.
Too much of an establishment entity.
Well, the church, I mean, the Catholic Church especially, it's sexist, it's against women, it doesn't ordain women, it's celibacy, how can you have celibacy in this time, and so on.
And you can't smoke weed.
Exactly.
What kind of a church is that?
And they're abusing...
Yeah.
And the whole sexual abuse, everybody is, it's the scandal for years in the papers, the terrible, terrible sexual abuse within the church, there's no excuse, and it's absolutely terrible, and I'm so glad it's now up in the open. But who cares about what is happening in our society? There's sexual abuse all around, in the midst of our society, in sport, everywhere. And it just goes on, and there's no movement that says that a cleansing is really needed.
Now, some people, of course, would say that the Me Too movement is a part of this kind of a cleansing.
It's so false, and it's
I was just going to say that.
Yeah, I mean,
but
if you walk around with hardly any clothes on your body, and then a man sort of gets interested, it's not really surprising. Yeah, so...
I've never tried that. But I'll take your word for it, sister. But at what point did you say it was when you found God? It began in '73, but you really became a Christian in '93. Is that right?
No. Even later, in '96. Well, I just go to this point. My husband had moved out. Total despair on my side, on his probably too, and I'm sure on his too. And a young lady living in the opposite house of the street came to my door, rang the doorbell, and said, "Pray." And she brought me a little. Catholics know what a novena is. It's a 9-day prayer, because the mother of Jesus prayed with the disciples for 9 days until the Holy Spirit came down. So Catholics pray novenas when they're in trouble. And she brought me this novena, and I was in trouble, and I did pray it at my meditation place, a Buddha statue, things from Red Indian Vision Quest, some avatar from Hindu, you find quite a few things when you search for 20 years. And here I'm sitting, praying this novena, and at the end of this novena, it was completely clear I would become a Catholic. No doubt, and it was in my own family the absolutely no-go, anything I could have become but not a Catholic. So it was clear I would become a Catholic, and then a totally new journey began. And how did I come to write the book?
Yeah. So at what point roughly are we talking about? You said the late 90s this was?
I was received in the church at 97.
97.
Right.
Okay. And that is a big leap for somebody from your background. to say, I am a Christian, and not just a Christian, but a Christian of the Catholic variety. You're from Bavaria, so in some ways it's not so strange because there are many, many Catholics in the southern part of Germany, and it's culturally a little bit more acceptable. But what took you from that decision to working in the field in which you've been working now?
Okay. I got an assignment to write a book. As a complete fresh woman in the Catholic world, write about apparitions of Mary. I thought, oh, how interesting this is happening. Hadn't heard about it before. And I proposed to Bertelsmann, I had been translating books for 20 years. I proposed them, I wrote 2 pages. I would like to write a book. And I actually got the assignment. Then I was in financial trouble, and I got an advance for a whole year, which kept me going for a whole year. Quite miraculous, because I wasn't an author at the time. So I wrote and it was Bertelsmann Verlag, the biggest publisher in Germany. So I wrote this first book, and it's actually the diary of my conversion. That book was successful.
Was that book, in fact, about apparitions of Mary, or it became the diary of your conversion?
That was the initial assignment, but it became a diary of my conversion. It's called My Path to Mary, The Power of Living Faith. My
Path to Mary, The Power of Living Faith.
I know you're an evangelical, please forgive me.
Yeah, we don't believe Mary even existed. we believe that Jesus came out of the brow of Zeus. Parthenogenetically. That's the way, and that's what the King James says, and we believe it. So, but what is the title of your book in German?
Mein Weg zu Maria, die Kraft lebendigen Glaubens.
See, it always sounds better in German.
It does.
Mein Weg zu Maria. Okay. Well, so at that point, obviously, you have gotten very serious about your faith. You've become public. You've written a book about your faith.
Right.
And then what?
Well, and then I began to be invited to give talks, and that I was a witness about this whole journey. And then I realized what is going on in our society. As a sociologist, I am interested in what is going on around me. So I began to realize that sexuality is really the issue of our time. And the abuse of sexuality is destroying people, it's destroying families, it's destroying the whole of societies. And I became aware of this, and then a book was put in my hand, beginning of 2000. It's by an English anthropologist. He's called J.D. Unwin. And he wrote a book called Sex and Culture, published by Oxford University Press in 1936.
J.D. Unwin.
That's it.
Yeah.
U-N-W-I-N.
W-I-N, yeah.
And 600 pages, serious study. He wanted to find out whether the thesis of Sigmund Freud, that culture arises through the sublimation of the sexual drive, was true. And what he found out was, and he said, if I had known what I would find out, I would have had started on this. What he found out was high culture can only exist with strict sexual morals, which is monogamy and virginity before marriage. Only when a society is able to keep to that, which is difficult, then you have high culture. And as soon as the society lets go of it, the culture drops down, and he says something like, leaves the stage of history within 3 generations.
So this book obviously struck you and did something to you, to your intellectual development. So what was your response after reading this book?
I looked around and says, well, apparently it's true. And then I started to look what is happening in our society. And my first book on these issues was for young people. It's called Ausbruch zur Liebe auf Deutsch, which means to break out of a prison. Ausbruch, breaking out to love. And the subtitle was for young people who want to have a future. Because it became obvious to me that this hookup culture, as you call it in American, this wild sexual, early sexual lifestyle into which young people were actually pushed by the sexual education, which
Yeah.
had already started in the 70s, would really ruin their future. And so I'm a mother of 3 children, and I had this strong motivation. I want to tell them something else. I want to tell them, wake up. Look at, your life is in front of you. My life was not in front of me anymore. There were many mistakes. Your life is in front of you. You have, all studies show that young people have a yearning for love and a yearning to have a family of their own. And if this is what you want, what do you do with your sexuality now to achieve your own aims? So that was really my own motivation to say something to young people. I also developed a weekend course for young people to give them a possibility to attain their own aims. And then I began to understand this whole issue of gender, that there's an ideology upon us which really goes to the root of human existence. And I wrote my first book on gender ideology called The Gender Revolution, Relativism in Action in 2006.
Relativism in action.
Exactly. I mean, how can there can't be more relativism than to relativieren the fact whether you're a woman and me a man, yeah? No?
Well,
Did I get something
it's what
wrong?
I was saying. No, it's what I was saying in my opening comments. What I find interesting is that the level of cultural pressure now enforced by the state, which is, to an American, the most horrifying thing, when the state begins to enforce a worldview,
Exactly.
which is, the Constitution prohibits us in America from establishing a religion. But in effect, you have a de facto secular religion, a view of all ultimate things, the human person, sexuality, and on and on and on, that's now being enforced by the state. But the cultural pressure is extraordinary. So when you say what you said, in a vacuum, to think about our futures and to think about how we look at sexuality as affecting children, anybody would say, oh, that's great, I'd like to know. But we live in a culture where to even begin to think about that publicly is an extraordinarily brave thing. Only within the church, at this point, I would argue, do you have people making these cases. We have here in the United States, Ryan Anderson has just written a book, When Harry Becomes Sally. There are a number of people, but the attack, and what bothers me, I suppose, and I think it's why genuinely I do resent Yale as a university, is that the very places where we ought to freely be able to examine the big questions, we are no longer encouraged to do that.
Yes, exactly.
So what happened to you when you decided to begin thinking as an academic, as a free thinker about these things? What did you encounter?
It wasn't really an issue for me. I just said, well, this is what I see happening is really dangerous for all of us. I have to write about it. There wasn't a conflict. I didn't have to overcome fear. I just felt I
wouldn't think that you would, because you strike me as a brave woman. But the question is that when you did these things, what was the response? Were these things that you wrote received well by people? Or, I mean, it just strikes me that anyone who writes on these things is demonized.
No? Yes, I mean, they were not received well. I have lots of stories. I could say what is always most painful is when people close to you who should know better, and you know they know better, when they exclude you. So when you're excluded from Christian media, for instance, yeah, things like this.
Because you're too hot to handle.
Yes, because, well, it's a totalitarian dynamic. It's like, it's true what you say, but our work is so important that we rather not be contaminated sort of by your reputation. It's okay what you say, but we don't want to have you in our
right. Well,
yeah?
Listen, I'm familiar with this dynamic in my own life.
Exactly.
Unfortunately,
yeah.
And I think it is. Listen, we understand that human nature is fallen, and we are never surprised when people do things like murder God incarnate. This is what people do. We are sinners and we're fallen. But it reminds me, since you're German, and I'm half German and have written about Bonhoeffer, it reminds me of the same chilling effect that you see in some totalitarian cultures, and especially in Germany in the early part of the Nazi movement. In other words, even when there was still an opportunity to speak up, people didn't speak up because they said the price to speak up, I could lose my job, my neighbor will look at me funny, I will be quiet. And some sociologists, some German sociologists, not you, came up with the term the spiral of silence.
That's Neumann, the founder of the Demoscopic Institute, Elisabeth Neumann.
Neumann.
She wrote a book, The Spiral of Silence.
Are you her niece? No?
No, but I worked in her institute as a sociology student.
Okay. You can't make us feel more stupid than being related to Heisenberg, so I shouldn't even bring it up. But this issue, the spiral of silence, this is the issue that struck me even when I was writing my book on Bonhoeffer. I thought, it's really creepy when you see in a totally free society in the West, not just in Europe, but I've seen it in America, obviously more, this chilling effect that you must think this. If you don't think this, be careful. Don't joke about this. And I thought, what am I, in Stalin's Russia? Or am I in Germany in 1934? I can't joke about this or this or this. That, to me, is deeply disturbing, which is why I'm so excited that you have been out speaking about this.
Well, we have the term political correctness for that.
Yeah.
And people adapt to political correctness much earlier than it is really necessary, what you were just saying. And some inner mechanism seems to work, where you always find out, am I still in agreement with my environment? Do they still like me? Yeah, this seems to be very deep. And as soon as our sensor says, oh, this is going to get you into conflict, we withdraw and we go the easy path.
Yeah.
And I think this is really one of the elements why we have gotten as far as we are, which is just amazing where we have come to with this whole transgender movement, which broke loose as soon as we had the same-sex marriage was legalized in 2015 in June. Immediately on the day afterwards, the bathroom battle started.
Yeah. Okay, so when you say global sexual revolution, you do imply that there are some people working very hard pushing this. Who are those people, and why are they pushing this? And what are they pushing exactly?
Why is a difficult question, but you can see they are pushing it. And the aims and the demands of the 68 movement, we use this word 68 as a symbol for the Seoul student rebellion, which was cultural Marxism, radical feminism, and sexual so-called liberation. This is now the strategy of the United Nations. I've had a tour around the United Nations today. I was really interested to see the building and the sites where all this is happening, and of the European Union, and of the big foundations, Rockefeller, Bill Gates, of the global NGOs, International Planned Parenthood, of the corporations Google, Facebook, YouTube. They are all unified in these issues. They are all unified in the LGBT issues, LGBTIQ++, yeah? Wherever this may take us to. And this is amazing, and I only described that they are unified, and why are they unified? What's going on behind it? Conspiracy, do not think about it. And actually, I don't.
Well, actually, I think it's like anything else. I mean, if you think about what was going on in Germany in the 30s, and people have to forgive me for drawing that parallel. I draw it advisedly for a couple of reasons. Only because I think it's so dramatic, and because I'm quite familiar with it. But the idea that some people, I mean, we know that Goebbels was pushing was pushing hard because he believed in National Socialist doctrine. But your average German falls along a continuum. In other words, some other people maybe loved Hitler and loved what was happening. Other people, they saw some things they liked, some things they didn't, all the way down to someone like your father, who bravely spoke against the Nazis. Obviously, Dietrich von Hildebrand, another very, very heroic figure, and Bonhoeffer. There were people speaking against it, but there's a continuum in every culture, and in our culture it's the same. There are people that say, I don't want to die on that hill, I don't want to get in an argument, it's not worth it. But in a sense, that's what allows us to drift as we have been drifting. At some point, you have to stop and take a measure of where you are. And when I'm able to stand up here at this podium and say, yesterday, a high school boy who claims to be a girl won the state championship in wrestling as a girl, that at any other point in our history, that would be a goofball joke, a stupid joke. It would be a comedy sketch, but it literally happened 2 days ago. And there's so many things like this happening. So the question is, what kind of people would allow this? It's one thing to read it, but then you think, what about the coaches? What about the parents? What about the other parents whose daughters are being wrestled by a guy claiming to be a woman? You wonder about that culture. In other words, is no one speaking up in that culture? That to me is actually the real issue right now, is that those people are not speaking up.
Right. I mean, now we have this whole transgender tsunami upon us, where doctors, school teachers, school directors, the heads of education, of ministers, they all say you have to affirm a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10-year-old child if they have so-called gender dysphoria, you have to affirm them in their gender dysphoria and give them puberty-blocking hormones. And this is happening even against the will of their parents. And all these people agree to it. These hormones have not been tested. What you know is they're very risky. They have cancer and blood clots and sterility for the rest of their life. And they're sending children who are not allowed to drive and who are not allowed to do quite a few other things, buy alcohol in the shop. They are sending children into gender transitioning in our culture, and at a time where you know that the suicide rate of people after transitioning is 20 times higher than average. What is happening?
20 times higher?
Yes.
After transitioning.
Yes.
Okay, now
there's
obviously...
there's a short euphoria, and then people see, oh my goodness, what have I done? Yeah?
But pro-transgender advocates, of course, would say what gay activists have said. They would say that it's the cultural pressure, it's the cultural milieu that makes these people feel uncomfortable, which is why we need to enforce a kind of public thinking that if you are allowed to express doubts about these things, you're one of the people causing these suicides.
Exactly. That's the narrative and that's the propaganda. And it's like with homosexuality. The Netherlands was the first country to legalize same-sex marriage 25 years ago, 21 years, I'm not quite sure. There's no discrimination. And the suicide rates of gay youth is just as high. Yeah, and there's a big study by Paul McHugh and a co-author, which says this is not according to science. It is put out.
Who said it's not according to science?
Paul McHugh, who was the John Hopkins psychiatrist, and it's in Atlantis Journal. It's published, and it is. He says all these narratives are not according to science.
And it does seem to me that that's the question, right? In other words, even if it were according to science, we haven't had the research or the time to determine whether it's according to science. In other words, there's been this just rush to move these things along. And again, it reminds me, when ideology takes over things like science, where do you first look? The first thing I do is look at the Third Reich, and you can see the same thing in China. You can see that there are totalitarian societies where they don't believe in freedom of inquiry. They don't believe in truth. They believe in the ideology of the state, and they're willing to enforce it. And it strikes me, as I hear you and I look at your book, that's what is happening. But again, the question is why?
When you spoke, I thought, be careful, because you're in New York, and there's the New York human rights law.
Yeah.
And if somebody feels discriminated,
Yeah.
maybe there's somebody in the audience who feels discriminated,
Right.
he can take you to court.
Right.
And you have to face something like $200,000 fine.
Right.
This is New York.
Right, and that's
and
law.
it just matters. And what is that is law. And I just in Spain now, the parliament has the equality law on the table, which is already in place in several of the sub-states of Spain. The whole principle of what is if I accuse you that you have done something wrong to me and you take me to court, the judge first says I'm innocent, and this is turned around. I have to prove.
That's in Spain.
Well, that's the human rights law in New York also. I have to prove that I did not discriminate you. No, you don't have to prove that I discriminated you. I have to prove that I did not discriminate you, which is difficult.
Yeah.
Because discrimination, what you feel about your gender expression, and so it's just according to your feelings.
Well,
what do I know about your feelings?
This gets to the intellectual roots of all of these things, right? It's this sort of romantic idea that feelings are everything, that feelings define us. So if I feel like a woman, I am a woman. If I feel offended, I am and have been harmed. I mean, those are the intellectual.
I wouldn't call it a romantic idea. I would call it just madness.
Well, there's no question. There's no question that it's madness. Don't applaud madness. Don't applaud madness. We're against it. But the point is that I would agree, of course, that it's madness. But I'm saying that you try to think of the intellectual roots. How do you get to a place in a culture? In other words, what are the values that people have that allow you to drift along these lines? And I do think that when you talk about feelings, you could say the same thing about marriage. Okay, once marriage was defined as feelings, once you said, well, I'm not happy in my marriage with Suzanne, so maybe it's not even a real marriage, because if I'm not in love every moment, then once you define marriage no longer as a legal contract, as something that we have done in a public, but as feelings, and then the government says, we're going to now create laws so that if you feel that you want to get out, no fault divorce, you get out, everything's fine. In other words, feelings have trumped everything else.
Right.
And
they've trumped the whole concept of Western science.
Of what?
Of Western science.
Yes.
The whole idea of rationality and research and hypothesis, and this is being trumped by ideology in our time, which is
you strike me as an especially lonely voice on this. Are there others out there speaking about this as you've been speaking?
I think so, yes.
You think so?
I mean, since the last 3 years, to my observation, there's really opposition growing against this gender ideology. In Germany, there are many, many books out, and in the United States, it is really getting into the public awareness that something is very wrong. But the people are in power.
Yeah.
You know, like the Jordan Peterson from Canada.
Yeah.
He did just one step of resistance. He said, I am not agreeing and I will not use artificial terms in language. Language is sacred to me, and I will just not do that. And so they threatened him to throw him out of his university. Yeah. Then he had a YouTube channel. They threatened him to close it down. And he said, what have I done wrong? I followed the rules. And then now he has 350,000 followers.
Yeah. Well, so how do you see this proceeding? Because to my mind, the difficulty always comes down to culture. In other words, if you have a culture of people who do not have sufficient courage and who do not understand the principles of a free society, then you can go in any direction. And the only reason Germany drifted the way it did under the Nazis was because there weren't enough people to do so. They had the power, but they chose not to use it. And every day it became more difficult. And I see that happening in America. It's the spiral of silence. Every day in America, it becomes more difficult to bring this up. If 10 years ago, Bruce Jenner had decided he was a woman, and it would still be so hard for people to swallow that people would joke about it or whatever. But by not saying anything, we've gotten to a point where you don't dare say anything because now the price is huge to bring it up.
And the price will go up.
Of course.
So that hits every one of us. The price will go up if you haven't spoken out so far. Will we speak out tomorrow? Will we speak out when it's really getting dangerous? And it is getting dangerous for many people by now. If you're in a position in the media or wherever, it can become really an existential threat, and you might lose your business. And we have many cases where this is already happening. So it is getting tough.
So what are our options in a free culture at this point? Where can we go? Do you see any positive outcome? Do you see enough of a backlash?
I think the pendulum is beginning to swing back. Whether it will succeed in swinging back, I'm not sure at all, because there's so much money and powers on the other side. But we still are in a phase where we can speak up, where we can publish books, where we can actually raise our voice. And maybe the whole transgender thing is now so radical and so mad and so evil, sacrificing children. To worship idols is a costly thing, because idols want blood. And they're getting blood in our society. They're getting the blood of 50 million unborn children, the idol of sex. We need abortion because we have this wild sexuality. And now they're getting to the children, and to do transitioning with children is again sending them on a suicidal course. And I think many people are beginning to realize that something really, really evil is happening. And it can happen to your children. It can happen in the schools where your children are, and it will happen. And so you have to rise if you have some responsibility for the next generation, whatever it costs you. And there's one which we see from you have done research, and Bonhoeffer written about him, a very beautiful book. 2 days ago we celebrated, we had the memory of the decapitation of Hans and Sophie Scholl. That was just recent, 75 years ago. So it's worth it. And how proud we are that we have these people within a whole people of thinkers and poets, which allowed Nazism to come on. But there's some. And we need every single voice, and every person in this room. What will you do in your environment? What will you do in your family? What will you do in your schools? Are you going to speak up, or are you going to say, no, this is more important, I can't risk it, and so on and so on?
That's ultimately the question, and I know that there are many people in this room that face this on a daily basis. You have children in schools in Manhattan. My daughter went to Marymount here, ostensibly a Catholic school, but the kind of political correctness that even in that school that she shared with me, the only good news is that my daughter is strong-willed enough and hard-headed enough to see how ridiculous it is. But I thought about the other girls in this situation. I thought, how extraordinary that even in an ostensibly Catholic environment, they're peddling ideas which are not only false ideas, but they can't even begin to be reconciled with Catholic doctrine, you know. And so if you're facing that in New York, in these schools, it is a high price to pay if your kids are being indoctrinated to speak up to the headmistress or to a teacher or something like that. But I really do think that if we don't do that, of course we only have ourselves to blame.
Well, I really think we need men in this movement. Men, physical men. True men.
I've always been a physical man. I'm not aware of any other kind.
Yeah, because feminism has weakened men tremendously, and in Germany, it's mostly women who are in the front of this battle.
Yeah.
Women who go to the school and say, well, my daughter or my son and so on, we need men to protect their families and to protect their children and to stand there with their manpower and say no. Yeah, say no with me, no. And this is what we really need, and this is what we are missing.
Oh, well, I certainly agree.
To a certain degree, yeah.
Well, I certainly agree, and I've even written about it. I think that part of what has happened since the 60s is this redefinition of everything, so that, in other words, every movement has good reasons for coming into being, right? So if men are abusive or in any sense, then there's a backlash. But the problem with the backlash is that then male strength is defined always as negative.
Exactly.
In other words, instead of the chivalry, the idea of chivalry, that male strength is in order to help and protect women, male strength is something that's disdained utterly as something that needs to be wiped out because it's dangerous. We need to get rid of male strength, and women need to be empowered. I mean, that's the ultimate cliche of our generation, is that the empowerment of women. Everyone says it as though it's inevitably a good thing or something, and anytime I hear any cliche, I bristle. Because it makes me know that people aren't thinking. When you use cliches,
exactly.
It's kind of proof that people aren't thinking. They're coasting on these cultural ideas without really thinking about it. But it's interesting that you say that we need men.
Yes.
When you have the breakdown of the family, and I mean, all of this, the breakdown of marriages and families, it does reduce men and it pushes them out. And so when you talk about this as a revolution, you liken it to, you say really it's the new Marxism. Talk about that for a moment.
It's not a revolution in the classical sense. Revolutions have arisen because there was mass suffering on some level. And the masses, it comes from below and goes up, it turns over the power structure of a society. Because there's true exploitation, suffering, and a feeling in the masses, something needs to be turned over and corrected. What is happening now, where are the masses of people who say we need same-sex marriage? Where are all these masses who say we need transitioning, we need to have a choice what gender we are? Where are they? It's absolutely induced. It's a top-down revolution. It comes from the top and goes downwards, and it permeates down to the kindergartens. You said, talk about Marxism. Marxism used to be, and had this, the truth in it was there was severe exploitation of the proletariat, of the workers. That was where they could sort of hold on and say, this must be changed. And it was terrible. It had to be changed. Then in the 68 movement, Marxism was picked up, but the students soon realized where's the proletariat? Where are the proletarians? The Berliners, when these demonstrations went on, they opened their windows and said, go to the other side of the wall. Yeah? Because they never were materially so well off as at the time.
Right.
So the people who really wanted to change society, which is the very big influence, is the Frankfurt School of Philosophy. Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, they all belong to that. They were in their heart communists. Their Institute of Sozialforschung was founded in Moscow. They edited the Marx and Lenin, 2 meters of Marx and Lenin. So they were really wanted to turn society around according to socialist, communist ideas.
And of course, they've infiltrated the academy.
Very much so. But they couldn't do it with the proletarians. They realized we need a new subject of revolution. And that was the minorities. And there was Marcuse who put out this poison which sort of got into the ears of my generation. If you liberate your sexuality, you will create paradise on earth. Sexuality is liberated. Yeah. People are addicted by the millions to pornography. Yeah. Families broke down. Paradise hasn't arrived. Yeah. And we are not learning from it. We are not saying there's something utterly and totally wrong. We are going in the wrong direction. We must change our ways.
Well,
this is not really happening.
I think we're beginning to see, as you were saying earlier, that when you have a high school boy beating the girls in wrestling and declared state champion, I think most Americans, they may not have a pulpit, a bully pulpit, a place to speak from in the media, but the point is most Americans realize this is ridiculous. Something has gone too far.
Yes.
And I think you can say the same thing along many lines, that when we have come to a point of carving up the culture into these interest groups and things, I do think that we are seeing something of a backlash. In other words, I think that there are people that are realizing this isn't going very well. I think the Me Too movement, to be honest, is at least a healthy sign. I think it's already gone too far, or maybe in the wrong direction. But the point is that I think it's healthy when people say, this kind of behavior is unacceptable. We cannot have people so sexualized that they can grope whomever they like with no consequences. At least we're beginning to deal with some of the bad fruit of the sexual revolution. And I also think porn addiction and those kinds of things, we're beginning to talk about that.
Right, I think a backlash is beginning, yes. The power is on the other side, but nature and rationality, science, and God are on our side. And I think there's something else I see happening, which seems to me new. I have, during these last years, been invited all over the world, not all over the world, but to faraway countries. And wherever I come, I see there are true disciples of Jesus Christ driving the opposition. And I meet them everywhere. That's the joy of this work, which is at the moment going on. Yeah, the joy of the work, meeting people who are serious about Jesus Christ. And they're really disciples. And something has hit them in their heart, and they have to work for it. They have to work for what the human being is really about. And this is also happening. And I think God is actually we see all this destruction, but there's something also happening of people really being called into a deep personal relationship with Jesus Christ in all denominations.
I'm happy to agree. I also think that what happens at some point when you hear of young people being given drugs because in their naivete they believe that they are a different gender or sex, and they say these things. I think that when the culture begins to see these things, people begin to speak up. In other words, I think that, as you were saying earlier, it goes so far that you say, wait a minute, we're seeing patterns here. I even see the same thing in the gay community, that when you think if you really love some young person who's struggling with his sexuality, you want to tell him the truth. You want to tell him that what everyone is saying may not be right for you. It may harm you. Yeah. We're not allowed on some level to say this. And I think that that's part of where it takes courage, is that if you really care about young people, you must speak up.
Exactly.
Because God will hold us accountable. I say it as a Christian. God will hold me accountable if I don't speak up because I don't want to get in an argument. What about that young man who needs someone to tell him there may be another path for you?
To tell a smoker that it's dangerous for his health if he smokes is not discriminating. Yeah. To tell a gay person your life has risks which are big, your life expectancy will be reduced to 10 or 20 years. You should know that and then make your choice. But we are not even allowed to say it. Even if we quote studies, we are, it's discrimination. Like I've just an experience, a church in need has a certain television channel that did an interview with me. What is the church teaching on homosexuality? It was on their website for a few years. And they just a few weeks ago, they got a message from YouTube. If you don't take this down, we will close down your whole channel on YouTube. I'm sitting there completely,
And how does YouTube have the right to do that? That's an extraordinary thing. Well, this is
They're all
what
doing
worries me, is that these
Yeah.
large corporations, whether it's YouTube or
Yes.
Twitter or Google or on and on and on, that they have extraordinary power.
They do.
And I worry that people in the corporate world are unwilling to speak up. I really think that the corporate world is the most gutless part of the culture at this point. That if people in corporate America would speak up, everything would change. But they've been addicted to it's about the bottom line, and you don't make waves. And that to me is really scary when somebody like YouTube can do that. Dennis Prager has had all kinds of his YouTube videos censored, and I thought, this is true madness, because if you watch them, they're wonderful, but we're talking about cultural power right now. I mean, ultimately, this is what we're talking about.
Right,
It's the
and they're creating really totalitarian laws, like this equality law in Spain, like the equality law in Canada. It is just unbelievable. If a family has a child that has gender dysphoria and the parents do not agree to transitioning, the state can come and take the child out of the family. Things like this.
I know. I assume that's not yet the case in the United States.
It's not yet in the United States, but
Because
what
we have the
about the
Second
bathroom?
Amendment.
What about the bathroom battle?
Well,
Yeah?
it's kind of funny. I think that there's something in the United States where we still have, there's something about our national character, which I think has gone away in Europe, sadly, but we still have enough people here willing to fight on some of these issues. Not on all of them, but on some of them.
Yes.
Because I think when the state says, we're going to come in and take your child, I mean, this happened in Germany with the homeschooling situation.
Exactly.
I mean, that's going to happen here as well.
Yeah.
And you start thinking, well, what are our foundational principles? Don't parents have rights over their children?
Right.
I mean, I have the right to teach my daughter stupid things. I have the right to teach her 2 + 2 = 5 as her parent. It's wrong, but parents do have rights, and parents will get some stuff wrong. The idea that these mandarins, these elites, can determine what is right and wrong and then step in. This is why if people in the West, and especially in America, don't understand our foundational principles and how self-government is supposed to work, it goes away. It goes away.
I mean, parents usually love their children. The state can't love our children. And the state is getting hold of our children, pulling them into collective daycare, tiny little children, and formatting the new sexualized gender person. Huxley put it all into his Brave New World. It's all there in his dystopia, and this is happening. And I think we just have to rise, and many people are beginning to rise.
Well, one of the reasons, as I said earlier, that we do Socrates in the City is because I want people to have a safe place to discuss things that aren't being discussed. I mean, shame on the mainstream media for not talking about this all day long, because this is one of the most central issues of our time. It's affecting our kids if it doesn't affect anybody else. So we ought to be talking about it, but we're not.
I used to be in talk shows until my book was published in 2012. Since then, never an invitation to talk show. This is how it works, yeah?
And if I'd known you'd written this book, I never would have asked you to be here at Socrates in the City. But it's too late. The damage is done. We paid for the room. The hors d'oeuvres were passed, and we're stuck. We're all going to go to jail, people. What can I tell you? No, Gabriele, I just want to say that it only takes a few people to speak up, because when someone speaks up, you see this in the story of Bonhoeffer, when someone speaks up, it galvanizes other people to speak up. It's the precise opposite of the idea of the spiral of silence. The spiral of silence is that if you don't speak up, you subtly encourage other people to shut up, which encourages other people to shut up, and it gets darker and darker and darker.
Exactly.
But if you speak up, as you have done gloriously in so many venues, you encourage others who never even knew it was possible to speak up, or who never even knew that there was so much information on this side, which they knew instinctively something was going on, but they didn't have the information, they didn't have the vocabulary of terms. So again, it's part of why we do what we do here, and why I'm so glad you consented to be here. I'm afraid we're out of time. Folks, let me say that our next event is March 20th. The great Greg Thornbury is going to be talking about his new book coming out. But those of you who are watching at home, or those of you who know that we put these things out on our website on videos, please, please, please share these videos. I'm begging you to share these videos, point people to this on Facebook and on Twitter, because unless we do that, these conversations stay here and it goes nowhere and life trundles on in ugly directions. So, Gabriele, from the bottom of my heart, a warm Socrates in the City, thank you for being here, folks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.